my name's Louise Masters and I'm a partner in the family team here at Sintons. I'm recording this for Founders Friday and I hope you find it interesting. Now, it's a bit of a curveball to what you may normally listen to because being from the family team, my team deals with things like divorce and dissolution. However, it's not all doom and gloom. There is a lot more that we deal with than that. So we deal with things like children matters. And the main focus of today's webinar is to talk about protective planning, which is something really important for people when they're starting out in a relationship or even later on. Now, traditionally, solicitors would, in a family setting, would deal with things quite in a vexatious way. We would get our boxing gloves on and try to take the other person for as much as we could. But we don't deal with things like that anymore. We do try to, where possible, deal with things amicably. And I'm trained as a collaborative lawyer, which means that if you have an issue with a family member or your spouse or partner, we would try and get together to deal with things in the best way for the family overall. And that's really important, especially where there are children involved, because you'll appreciate you need to have that ongoing relationship. And it's important to highlight that because you may need some advice in this area in the future. So we need to bear that in mind. It's the best way to try and negotiate and resolve things. Now, I've touched upon protective planning. What does that mean? Well, if you go into a relationship or a marriage and you don't do anything with your finances, there could be implications if the relationship breaks down. So the point of these areas and this advice is just so that you can be sure that if, for example, you have greater assets than your partner or your spouse to be, there may be a way to protect them should the relationship fail. So the first thing I want to talk about is cohabitation agreements. So what that is, if you have a partner and you're not going to get married yet, however, you are going to move in together. Now that may take various forms. You may move into their house, they may move into yours, or you may be buying a property together. If that happens, you really need to consider the implications if you separate. Now, it's not very romantic, but it is very sensible. So, if you don't do anything about it, and say, for example, you buy a property together, you may put some of the deposit in, say, for example, £50,000. Your partner may put nothing in. If you simply put the property into joint names, when you separate, your partner is essentially entitled to half of what you invested. And some people may be happy with that. But generally, most people want to protect what they've put in, especially if the relationship is in the early stages. So what you can do is enter into what's called a cohabitation agreement. And this regulates the arrangements between you and your partner. But having said that, you can also have a cohabitation agreement for someone who is not your partner. For example, friends who you may be buying a property with, siblings, parents, or anyone else that you may not be in a relationship with. Now, a cohabitation agreement can include how the property is held, how you're going to separate the money if you should end the relationship or the commercial agreement, really. It can include things like chattels of the property, so the furniture and the contents, who's going to take what if the relationship should break down. Now, cohabitation agreements are relatively new as a concept, and therefore they haven't been tested through the courts. So as to enforceability, the general guidance is that as long as they're entered into properly, they should be enforceable, because essentially at the end of the day, it's a contract between you and the other person. So as long as the criteria for entering into a contract has been adhered to, then these should be enforceable. So when else might a cohabitation agreement be appropriate? if, for example, you own a property and it has a significant amount of equity and your partner's going to move in with you, or vice versa, again, it's just laying down on paper the understanding as to how things should be separated if the relationship breaks down. And I'll give you a little nugget, actually, quite a recent case when there was no cohabitation agreement and it went spectacularly wrong for the person who invested the money in the property. So a couple got together in about 2006, and in 2009, the male partner purchased a property. He used £1.5 million of his own money to purchase this property, but he put it into joint names with his partner. And it was intended to be used as a holiday home for them because they each had properties in their own name separately. So later that year, about 9 months after the purchase of the property, the relationship broke down. The female partner lived in the said property. The male partner didn't, he lived in the other property. And a number of years passed, and then the male partner, who invested all of the money in the first place, said to the female partner, his ex-partner at this point, "We need to sell up and I need to get my money back." She said, "Well, it's a joint property, so the money needs to be split equally." It went through the court system, and the court decided that because the property was in joint names, they would each come out with half of the equity. And whilst that might seem unfair, that's the way it is if you don't have an agreement such as a cohabitation agreement setting out how you want the property to be dealt with. So it's really, really crucial that if you're entering into a relationship like this, you consider a document like that. So the next thing to think about is a nuptial agreement. That will be relevant if you're going to marry somebody. So about 6 months before the wedding, you should seek legal advice about entering into a nuptial agreement. Now, if you've got a cohabitation agreement in place and then you're going to get married to that person, quite easily the cohabitation agreement can be turned into a nuptial agreement. So just bear that in mind. But as I say, you should seek legal advice about 6 months before the wedding, because it takes quite a long time to go through the process, and there are set criteria which should be adhered to make it more watertight. And one of those is that the agreement should be signed at least 28 days before the wedding. Well, before that, we need to exchange disclosure, which is both of you swapping financial information. We need to seek legal advice for both of you separately, and we need to make sure that the agreement's fair. So all of that takes time. So about 6 months before the wedding, make sure you start to seek legal advice about the process. The nuptial agreements aren't 100% legally binding. But if they're entered into properly, taking into the criteria I've just mentioned there, they should be upheld by the court. Now, there's also some guidance by the Law Commission, which says that if this criteria is adhered to, the documentation should be binding. Now, that guidance hasn't yet been made into law, but it probably will come in the future. So what you have here is a thought out process, which might not be romantic, but is very, very sensible if one of you is bringing more wealth into the marriage than the other party. And given that this is for Founders Friday, that might be the case. This is a great target audience to think, you know, I'm doing well in my business, I've got this amount of money, I'm going to get married. Do I want to protect that should things in the marriage fail? So it's really something you should be considering if you're going to get married. Now, the other thing is, you may be listening to this webinar and you might already be married. Well, you can also have what's called a postnuptial agreement. And what that means is you're entering into a contract like this, but you're already married. And there might be various reasons for that. You may have, for example, received an inheritance that you want to protect, or you may have started your company and you might want to try and protect that during the marriage. So just bear that in mind. You're not outcast if you're already married. It's something that we can do during marriage. So as I said, it's really something you should just have at the back of your mind if you're entering into a relationship or a transaction with a family member or a friend, or you're going to get married and you do want to protect your assets. I reiterate, it's not romantic, but it's very, very sensible. And unfortunately, in lots and lots of cases, these type of things aren't considered prior to the event, which therefore keeps my team in a job, because we have to sort it out after the event once the relationship's broken down. And it can be very, very complex and costly to resolve that later on, when in fact, had you thought about these things prior to going into the relationship, it could have been documented, which would prevent the fallout later on. So have a good think about that if you're entering into something like this. So I've already touched upon this, but what I wanted to say is when things go wrong in the relationship, if you are just cohabitees, so you're just living together, you haven't been married, there is a real and current misconception that you will be, over a period of time, you will become a common law husband or wife. And by virtue of that, you will be entitled to some money from the other person. And unfortunately, that is a complete myth. So you could have been in a relationship with someone for 10 years and not contributed financially to the property possibly owned by your partner, and you're not entitled to anything. It falls back to property law. If the property is held in the other person's name and you've made no contribution, then you wouldn't be entitled to anything. So this again links back to the cohabitation agreement. It's worth thinking about, and it's worth documenting what your intentions are in the relationship and what you want to happen should it fail. Moving on to think about the divorce, unfortunately, currently, if you are going to divorce, you have to blame the other person for the breakdown of the marriage. But what's really important to acknowledge now, and thankfully the law has caught up with society, shortly there will be a no-fault divorce. And we're not quite sure how that's going to be technically worded as yet, because it hasn't come into law. However, you should be able to say to the court that the marriage has simply broken down, it's nobody's fault, and you want to get a divorce. And it's really important that that should happen, because that does happen in a lot of relationships, and you don't want to blame the other person, but unfortunately the law as it currently stands say that you have to do that. So the next thing to mention is that if there is blame in the relationship, it doesn't affect how the finances are dealt with unless we've got a prenup, as mentioned earlier. And if you are married and you are going to get divorced with no nuptial agreement, there are a set of criteria which the court take into account, but essentially they treat the finances as one matrimonial pot, which are kind of up for grabs and need to be separated with the parties' financial needs first in mind. So again, if that's not how you want to deal with things, should your relationship or marriage break down, please think about the prenup that I've mentioned earlier. So that's it from me today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that I've been able to give you an overview of family law. And there may be some things where you think, gosh, that applies to my situation, or in the future, if your circumstances change, it might apply to your situation. So please, if you need any more information about cohabitation, nuptial agreements, divorce, or children matters, please get in touch with myself, Louise Masters, partner in the family team at Sintons. And if you need any more resources or any more information, please check online at www.sintons.co.uk. Thanks.